Past 10 million, you reach escape velocity. You're out of the gravity well. The money compounds faster than you can spend it, unless you're trying to spend it. You're making multiple six figures a year in passive income. You could maintain an upper middle-class lifestyle forever on just the interest. You've won capitalism. Congratulations. You're now playing a game that 99% of humanity will never access. And it's the loneliest place you've ever been. Not because you're isolated. You can buy connection. You can fly friends on vacation. You can donate to causes. You can throw parties. But connection isn't the same as understanding. And nobody understands what this altitude feels like unless they're here. Your problems sound like parody. You're stressed about tax optimization strategies. You're worried about which trust structure minimizes estate tax while maintaining flexibility for charitable giving. You're trying to decide if you should invest in your friend's startup, even though you know it's probably going to fail. Because what's $200,000 in the context of preserving a relationship? These are real problems. They cause real stress, but you can't talk about them. If you talk about them, you sound like an asshole. So you stay quiet, and the silence calcifies into distance. You're surrounded by people, but you're operating in a different reality. And here's the part that breaks people. The goalposts keep moving. You thought 10 million was enough. Then you meet someone with 50 million, and you realize they have access to deal flow you don't. They're in rooms you're not in. They're playing a game you didn't know existed. And if you're not careful, you start chasing again. Not because you need more money, because you need to feel like you're winning. And the finish line keeps receding. Researchers at Harvard studied happiness across income levels and found that emotional well-being plateaus around $75,000 in annual income for daily happiness. But life satisfaction, the sense that your life is going well, continues to increase with income with no plateau. You're not happier day to day, but you're more satisfied with the story you're telling yourself about your life. That's not shallow. That's human. We're narrative creatures. We need to believe our story is going somewhere. But at this level, the story gets hard to tell, because the struggle is gone. And struggle is what makes stories compelling. You're the hero who defeated the dragon, and now you're just living in the castle, dealing with dragon-free castle problems. And nobody wants to hear that story. The people who find peace at this altitude do something radical. They stop viewing money as the score. They start viewing it as a tool, and they get obsessive about what they're building with that tool. They're not working for more money. They're working because the work itself is the point. They've reconnected with the intrinsic motivation that got buried under years of extrinsic pressure. They're building companies not to exit, but to exist. They're creating art not to sell, but to say something. They're solving problems not because there's a market, but because the problem bothers them. They've become wealthy enough to be poor again. Poor in the sense that they're doing things with no immediate economic return. They're back to playing. But it takes killing another part of yourself to get here. The part that needs to prove something. The part that's still fighting your father's ghost, or your high school bully, or your own younger self who felt invisible. If you're still trying to prove something at this level, you'll chase forever. Because there's always someone with more. Always another level. Always another room you're not in. You have to become okay with enough. And enough is not a number. It's a nervous system state. It's the ability to sit in a room alone with your thoughts and not feel like you should be doing more. Most people never get there, not because they don't have enough money, because they never trained the nervous system. They just kept running, faster and faster, until they forgot why they were running. At 100 million and beyond, you're not just wealthy, You're a different species. The rules don't apply. Not because you're breaking them, because you exist outside the system they were designed to regulate. You don't wait in lines. You don't fly commercial. You don't worry about recessions in the way normal people worry about recessions. You worry about wealth preservation across generations. You worry about whether your children will be ruined by never having to struggle. You worry about legacy and meaning, and whether anything you do matters in the scope of geological time. You've solved every material problem a human can have, and you've discovered that material problems were never the real problems. They were just loud enough to drown out the real problems. The real problems are existential. What does a life well lived look like? What do you owe to the world that gave you this opportunity? How do you raise children who understand the value of money when they'll never experience its absence? How do you maintain relationships with people when every interaction is shadowed by the question of whether they want something from you? These aren't rich people problems in the dismissive sense. These are human problems, with all the lower-level problems stripped away. And they're harder, because you can't solve them with money. There's research from the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology showing that people's happiness is more determined by their rank within their peer group than their absolute wealth. A lawyer making $200,000 a year, surrounded by lawyers making $300,000, is less happy than a teacher making $60,000, surrounded by teachers making $50,000. It's not the money. It's the relative position. At this altitude, your peer group is other people with 9 figures, and suddenly you're comparing yourself to billionaires. You're the broke one again. In the sickest twist of psychology, you've climbed all the way out of poverty, only to create a new poverty in your mind. The only way to win is to stop playing, to refuse the comparison, to build a life based on metrics you choose. But that requires a level of self-awareness that most people never develop, because developing it requires discomfort. And you have enough money to avoid all discomfort forever. So most don't. They just keep playing. Bigger houses, bigger boats, bigger deals, not because they want them, because they don't know what else to do. They're addicted to the game, and the game is their identity. And if they stop playing, they don't know who they are. Here's what nobody tells you about the full journey. The math is real. The freedom is real. The options are real. But the idea that money solves your problems is a misunderstanding of what problems are. Money solves material problems. It doesn't solve neurochemical problems. It doesn't solve childhood trauma. It doesn't solve the fact that your brain is still running software designed for a world that no longer exists. It doesn't solve the fundamental human need to feel like you matter. At $0, you think you need money to be happy. At $100 million, you realize happiness was never about money. It was about agency, the feeling that your decisions matter, that you can shape your life. And here's the cosmic joke. You had more agency at 0 than you realized. You just couldn't see it. You were too busy surviving. The prison wasn't the lack of money. The prison was the belief that you were trapped. And that belief was so loud, you couldn't hear anything else. Rich people aren't happier because they have money. They're happier because they have options. And options create the illusion of control. But it's still an illusion. You can't control whether you get cancer. You can't control whether someone you love dies. You can't control whether the thing you build matters. You can only control your response. And that was always true, at every level, from 0 to 100 million. The journey through wealth is really a journey through illusions. At 0, the illusion is that money will save you. At 1,000, the illusion is that just a little more will make you secure. At 100,000, the illusion is that you're almost there. At 1,000,000, the illusion is that you've made it. At 10,000,000, the illusion is that you're free. At 100,000,000, the illusion finally breaks, and you realize you were always free. Or you were never free, depending on how you look at it. So what's the point? If money doesn't solve the real problems, why chase it at all? Because agency is real, even if control is an illusion. Because options are valuable, even if they don't guarantee happiness. Because the journey forces you to become someone capable of handling the altitude. You can't reach escape velocity as the person you are now. The old you will sabotage it, will spend it, will give it away, will make decisions that pull you back down. You have to become someone different. Someone who can delay gratification, someone who can tolerate being misunderstood, someone who can sit in a room alone and not need external validation to feel okay. And that person is valuable regardless of the money. The wealth is just proof you built that person. It's a receipt, not the product. The real product is you. The version of you that can operate at high altitudes without oxygen, that can tolerate the loneliness, that can make decisions in the absence of certainty, that can keep going when there's no one left to impress. That's what the journey builds. The money is just a measurement tool, a way to keep score while you're becoming someone capable of not needing a score.
Every stage strips away a different illusion, and every illusion you lose makes you lonelier. But it also makes you realer, more actual, less reactive, less dependent on external conditions for your internal state. At $0, you're completely dependent. Your mood is dictated by your bank balance, by your boss's mood, by whether your car starts. At 100,000,000, you're still dependent, just on different things. On whether your kids turn out okay, on whether your legacy matters, on whether you're living in alignment with some definition of integrity you're not even sure you believe in. The goal isn't independence. That's another illusion. The goal is choosing your dependencies. At 0, you don't get to choose. At 100,000,000, you do. And that choice is the entire game. The physics of wealth is simple. Spend less than you earn. Invest the difference. Increase your earnings. Repeat for decades. That's it. That's the whole formula. A child could understand it, but a child can't execute it. Because execution requires becoming someone most people refuse to become. Someone boring. Someone patient. Someone willing to be invisible while everyone around them is performing. Someone willing to walk through the suffocation layer without making it their identity. Through the treadmill trap without stepping on. Through the visibility horizon without hiding. Through the severance layer without breaking. Through escape velocity without losing yourself in the altitude. It requires staying sane in a system designed to make you crazy. Staying focused in an environment engineered for distraction. Staying connected to future you while present you is screaming for relief. That's the real journey, not the money, the becoming. And here's what I can promise you. The door is open. The math is public. The path is visible. Millions of people have walked it. It's not secret. It's not complex. It's just hard. Hard because it requires you to operate in a different timescale than your biology wants. Hard because it requires you to become alien to your peer group. Hard because it requires you to be okay with delayed gratification in a world that's screaming at you to gratify now. But the physics is on your side. Compound interest is on your side. Time is on your side. If you start, if you stay, if you become the kind of person who can tolerate the journey, The altitude is waiting. The escape velocity is achievable. You just have to be willing to burn the fuel. And the fuel is years of your life spent becoming someone you're not yet. Someone who can breathe in thin air. The question isn't whether you can do it. The question is whether you're willing to become who you'd have to become to do it. That's the only question that ever mattered. The money is just the answer to whether you answered yes. Money doesn't buy happiness. You've heard it 1,000 times. It's a lie the comfortable tell themselves to sleep better at night. But here's the truth nobody mentions. Money doesn't buy misery either. It buys physics. It changes the mathematics of your existence, the gravitational field you operate in. And most people have no idea what that actually feels like until they're already trapped in the wrong orbit. Think of wealth as orbital velocity, not motivation, not mindset, velocity. At $0, you're not on the ground, you're below it, buried. Every dollar you don't have creates drag. You're fighting atmospheric resistance just to breathe. At 10,000, you've broken surface tension. At 100,000, you're airborne, but still burning fuel to stay aloft. At 1,000,000, you've reached low orbit. Gravity still pulls, but you're moving fast enough that falling takes longer. At 10,000,000, you're in stable orbit. At 100,000,000, you've achieved escape velocity. You're no longer governed by the same physics as everyone else. This isn't a metaphor. This is thermodynamics applied to human decisions. And the distance between each stage isn't linear, it's exponential. The gap between $0 and $10,000 feels infinite when you're at 0. The gap between 10 million and 100 million feels like a rounding error when you're at 10 million. But the internal cost, the person you have to become, that equation runs in reverse. Let me show you what nobody tells you about the journey through each altitude. Not the Instagram version, the neurochemistry, the mathematics of compound isolation, the price your biology pays at every stage. At $0 to $10,000, you're living in what I call the suffocation layer. Your brain isn't designed to plan. It's designed to survive. When your bank account reads $300 and rent is due in 5 days, your prefrontal cortex, the part that does long-term thinking, gets overridden by your amygdala. That's not weakness. That's evolution. Your ancestors who stopped to contemplate the meaning of life when a tiger appeared didn't become your ancestors. They became lunch. Princeton researchers Sendhil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir published a study showing that poverty reduces cognitive capacity by the equivalent of 13 IQ points. Not because poor people are less intelligent, because scarcity creates a cognitive load that's always running in the background. It's like trying to run complex calculations on a computer that's using 80% of its processing power just to keep the fan running. You're not making bad decisions. You're making the only decisions your available processing power can compute. At this level, a medical emergency isn't an inconvenience. It's an extinction event. A car breakdown isn't a hassle. It's a cascading system failure that costs you the job, which costs you the apartment, which costs you the ability to interview for the next job because you're sleeping in your car, if you have a car. The math is simple. Below 10,000 in liquid assets, you're paying what I call the poverty premium. You pay more for everything. You can't buy in bulk. You pay check cashing fees because you can't maintain the minimum balance for a free checking account. You buy cheap shoes 3 times instead of expensive shoes once. You pay late fees because you're juggling which bill can be delayed. The system charges you a tax for being broke. And here's what nobody tells you. The way out isn't discipline. It's velocity. You don't need a budget, you need momentum. Every dollar at this stage must be aimed at one thing,
increasing your earning capacity. Not saving, not investing, earning. Take the night shift that pays $2 more per hour. Learn the skill that gets you the certification. Move to the city where the job market is tighter. The opportunity cost of Netflix is measurable in years at this level. The rich don't get out of this layer through saving. They get out through obsessive focus on the income line. Your job isn't to be smart with money. Your job is to acquire escape velocity. Between $10,000 and $100,000, you enter what I call the treadmill trap. You're making money now, real money by the standards you grew up with. You can breathe, and that's exactly when the trap closes. Because now you're not fighting to survive, you're fighting to signal. Your brain's reward system evolved in tribes of 150 people. Status mattered because it determined access to resources and mates. That system is still running. It doesn't know the difference between the savannah and the suburb. It just knows that your coworker has a newer car, and your brain interprets that as a threat to your tribal standing. So you upgrade, and the treadmill speeds up. This is where people make the fatal mistake. They start thinking about deserving things. You work hard. You deserve a nice apartment, a reliable car, a vacation. And technically, you're right. You can afford the monthly payment. But affordability and cost are not the same thing. A $600 car payment you can afford is $600 that isn't compounding. Over 10 years, at a modest 7% return, that's $104,000 you traded for a depreciating asset and the neurochemical hit of driving something that signals success. You traded escape velocity for dopamine. And here's the cruelest part. It feels responsible. You're not being crazy. You're not buying a yacht. You're just living a normal middle-class life. And that normalcy is precisely calibrated to keep you on the treadmill forever. The math is vicious. At $75,000 in income, after taxes, after rent, after car, after insurance, after food, after utilities, after the subscriptions you forgot you're paying for, you're saving maybe 10% if you're disciplined. That's $7,500 a year. At that rate, reaching $1 million in net worth takes 30 years, if nothing goes wrong, if you never have kids, if your industry doesn't collapse, if your health holds, if inflation stays low. You're not building wealth. You're running on a treadmill that's tilted slightly upward, hoping you don't trip. The people who escape this layer do something that feels irresponsible. They live like they make half what they make. They drive the paid-off Honda while making 6 figures. They rent the small apartment in the unsexy neighborhood. They become invisible, and their bank accounts become exponential. Because they understand something crucial. At this level, your most valuable asset isn't your income. It's the gap between your income and your expenses. That gap is your escape velocity. The wider it is, the faster you accelerate. Every dollar in that gap is a soldier you're deploying to fight for your freedom. But it requires something painful. It requires watching your peers signal status while you signal nothing. It requires the discipline to be boring, and boredom doesn't trigger dopamine. So most people stay on the treadmill, comfortable, tired, wondering why wealth feels so far away when they're making good money. From 100,000 to 1 million in net worth, you cross into the visibility horizon. And this is where the math gets weird. Because now the numbers are big enough that compounding starts to feel real. You can watch your investments grow by more in a month than you used to make in a month. Your money is starting to work. But something else happens. Something nobody warns you about. The people around you start to change shape. Not them, your perception of them. You start to see the matrix. You notice your coworker, who makes the same salary as you, bought a boat. You do the math in your head automatically now. That's $40,000. At a 7% return over 20 years, that's $160,000 he traded for weekend lake access, and the slip fees, and the maintenance, and the insurance, and the depreciation. You're not judging him. You're just calculating. And you can't stop calculating. Your friend complains about being broke over dinner at a restaurant where the entrees cost $35. You nod sympathetically while your brain runs the numbers. She's spending $1,500 a month eating out. That's $18,000 a year. That's $72,000 every 4 years. She's not broke. She's making choices she doesn't realize she's making. And you start to feel distant. Because you can't say this out loud. If you say this out loud, you're the asshole. You're the one who changed. But you didn't change. You just learned to see the price tags on different futures. This is what researchers call lifestyle creep mitigation. But that phrase doesn't capture the social cost. It's not about budgets. It's about operating in a different temporal dimension than the people you grew up with. They're optimizing for the present. You're optimizing for a future they don't believe in because they've never seen it. You're playing a different game on the same board. And it's lonely. Not lonely like sadness. Lonely like being the only person who can see in a specific spectrum of light. You're seeing decade-scale consequences to daily decisions, and everyone around you is seeing monthly budget items. MIT did research on delayed gratification, showing that the ability to visualize your future self as a continuous entity, not a different person, correlates heavily with wealth accumulation. Poor people don't lack discipline. They lack the neurological connection to their future selves. When your future is uncertain, your future self is a stranger. Why sacrifice for a stranger? At this level, you've built that connection. Your future self is real to you, more real than your present comfort, and that makes you alien to people still living in the now. The way through this layer is counterintuitive. You don't need to cut more. You need to earn more. Because you've already optimized the expense side. You're saving 30, 40, maybe 50% of your income. The only way to accelerate now is to expand the top line. This is where the employee mindset hits a ceiling. Trading time for money has a mathematical limit. There are only so many hours. The people who break through to 8 figures understand this shift viscerally. They stop asking, how do I save more? And start asking, how do I capture more value? They start businesses. They negotiate equity. They move from salary to ownership. They stop being a cost center and become a profit center. But this requires killing a part of yourself, the part that values security, the part that wants to be liked, the part that doesn't want to be that guy who's always working. You have to become okay with being misunderstood, because everyone around you will think you're obsessed. And they're right. You are. But they think obsession is pathology. You know, it's physics. Between 1 million and 10 million, you enter the severance layer. You've won. By every definition you grew up with, you've won. You have more money than your parents ever dreamed of. You never have to worry about rent. You could stop working and coast for years, maybe decades, if you're careful. And that's exactly when the trap reveals its true form. Because now the question isn't, can I survive? It's, what do I actually want? And most people have never actually asked that question. They've been too busy surviving, too busy climbing. The goal was always just more money, more security, more options. But now you have options, real ones. You could retire early. You could start that business you always talked about. You could travel for a year. You could do anything. And the paralysis is suffocating. Psychologists call this the paradox of choice, but that phrase makes it sound theoretical. It's not theoretical. It's 3 a.m. and you're lying awake with $1 million in index funds and no idea why you're still going to a job you don't care about. It's having fuck you money and realizing you don't know who to say fuck you to. Because the enemy was never your boss. The enemy was uncertainty. And you killed uncertainty. And now, you're not sure what you were fighting for. This is where people make catastrophic mistakes. They get divorced because they finally have the financial cushion to blow up their life. They quit their job without a plan because they can afford to. They buy the Tesla and the renovation and the business class flights because what's the point of money if you don't enjoy it? And they're right, in a sense, but they're confusing relief with purpose. They're spending money to feel something because the achievement didn't feel how they expected. They thought hitting 7 figures would feel like victory. It feels like silence. The people who make it to 9 figures do something different here. They don't ask, what do I want? They ask, what game do I actually want to play? Because they realize wealth isn't the game. Wealth is the entry fee to choose your game. Some choose impact. They start foundations, they fund research, they build things that outlive them. Some choose mastery. They go deep on a craft because now they can afford to be bad at something while they learn. Some choose freedom. They design lives with 0 obligations and maximum optionality. But they all choose consciously, not by default. And the choice is terrifying because it's real. At broke, your choices are constrained. The path is narrow. At wealthy, the path is wide. And a wide path requires you to know where you're going. Most people don't. So they wander, comfortable, aimless, rich, and confused. Here's what gets you through this layer. You have to kill the part of you that needs external validation. The part that measures success by what other people think. Because nobody is impressed by 7 figures anymore. Your broke friends think you're rich beyond imagination. Your rich friends think you're doing fine, but not impressive. You're in the worst possible position for social validation. You have too much to relate down and not enough to compete up. So you have to stop playing that game entirely. You have to find internal scorecards, metrics only you can see, progress only you care about. That's not self-help. That's survival. Because if you're still optimizing for what other people think at this level, you'll spend yourself back down to 0 trying to impress people who don't care.